Well, I hope everyone's doing well tonight. We are pleased to be back for our midweek service, and we're glad that everybody's here. Just a quick reminder to silence your cell phones before we get started. I forgot mine at home, so I don't have to worry about that. But we'll let everybody get set down here in just a second, and then Brother Chad Stacy will open us in prayer, and then we will get into our lesson tonight. All right, Brother Chad, would you like to say a prayer, please? Amen. All right, well, we're picking up, as you can see, in Ezekiel chapter 34. We will, Lord willing, discuss a question here in verse 2, and then we might move on to another question as well. But here in Ezekiel chapter 34, here is the question. In verse 1 it says, "The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord God unto the shepherds, Woe be to the shepherds of Israel that do feed themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flock?" And so that's our question for this session this evening as we begin. Should not the shepherds feed the flock? We're going to start out as we have with just about every other lesson, looking at some background of this question. What is the background of the situation with Ezekiel right now and the nation of Israel and all of that? And really, to get the immediate context, we've got to go back to chapter 32. It says in verse 1, "And it came to pass in the 12th year, in the 12th month, in the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying." And what you see as you continue to go through chapter 32 is that it seems to be about 1 year after the destruction of Jerusalem. It's very well described and very well made chronological. You look at verse 17. "And it came to pass also in the 12th year, in the 15th day of the month, that the word of the Lord came unto me." And so what we see there is that we're about a year removed from the destruction of Jerusalem. And obviously, the world as Jews knew it has completely been upended. And there is chaos in their lives, and there are questions and there are doubts with the people of Israel. And the biggest question is a similar question that Jeremiah dealt with. Do we follow God through this trouble, or do we depend on the nations round about us to see us through this difficulty? And as we move to chapter 33, the focus shifts from the people of God who have done foolishly and are being punished, and it shifts to Ezekiel himself. Look at verse 1 of chapter 33. It says, "Again the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, speak to the children of thy people, and say unto them, When I bring a sword upon a land, if the people of the land take a man of their coasts, and set him for their watchman, if when he sees the sword come upon the land, he blow up on the trumpet and warn the people, then whosoever," verse 4, "hears the sound of the trumpet, and taketh not warning, if the sword come and take him away, his blood shall be upon his own head. He heard the sound of the trumpet and took not warning. His blood shall be upon him, but he that taketh warning shall deliver his soul. But if the watchman see the sword come, and blow not the trumpet, and the people be not warned, if the sword come and take any person from among them, he is taken away in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at the watchman's hand. If you remember when we did our invitation Wednesday night, we gave a preview of this particular passage. And I think this sets the stage for what's going to happen in chapter 34. We have a responsibility to those around us, whatever our role might be. We're talking about the shepherds, and of course there's an obvious connection between the shepherds here and what group of people in the church today? The elders. But it's not only the elders. Anybody who has a responsibility to someone else needs to take heed to the things mentioned in chapter 34. And I think that's made clear in chapter 33. As I mentioned in the invitation Wednesday night, every one of us in some shape, form, or fashion is a watchman for somebody else. And in particular, if we're parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, if we are Bible class teachers, if we're elders and deacons, whatever the role that we play, we have someone for whom we should be watching. And so we are the watchmen. So this immediate context is about personal responsibility. Personal responsibility for those who are around us. And so the challenge is going to be for every one of us as we move through. So God reminded Ezekiel that he was to be a watchman for God's people. And if he failed to do that, the people who lived sinful lives would answer for their own states. But Ezekiel also would answer. Now, what do you think we can imply from that or infer from that relative to Ezekiel's state of mind, maybe? Why would God take a whole chapter to remind Ezekiel that he was to be a watchman? What's the danger? Do what? Okay, it seems to be either he was already beginning to slack, as you say, or that thought was in his mind. I mean, and at the very least, we know for physical watchmen, what's the danger of a physical watchman? He might fall asleep on the watch, right? He might fail to watch. So it's almost human nature to lose focus as we try to watch for those around us. And so this is a reminder to Ezekiel to mind his commission and his obligation that he has to other people. And so that's in chapter 33, and it brings us here to chapter 34. And again, this question is, should not the shepherds feed the flocks? And this is obviously a rhetorical question. That is a question whose answer is understood. Should shepherds feed their flocks? Well, absolutely. Absolutely. Someone who is a shepherd should feed their flocks. And so this answer, like I said, is easily understood. The shepherds of Israel, however, had done the exact opposite. I want you to pick up in verse 3. He says, You shepherds, eat the fat, and you clothe you with wool. You kill them that are fed, but you feed not the flock. Notice they take all of the benefits from the flock. They eat the fat of the flock. They wear the wool from the flock, but then they don't feed the flock themselves. The New Testament references an Old Testament principle when Paul is talking about his right to be paid and supported by the people he preached to. He said, you shall not do what? Remember the Old Testament principle about an ox? You shall not muzzle the ox. Yeah. Why? Yes, you're exploiting the animal, right? If you're going to use the animal for work, the least you can do is feed the animal. If you're going to use the sheep for the wool and for the meat and for the fat and for all of the things that you do, you should at least be willing to take care of the animals that are in your charge. And so in verse 3 it says, you take all of the benefits of the flock, but you don't feed the flock. He says in verse 4, the diseased have you not strengthened, neither have you healed that which was sick. Neither have you bound up that which was broken, neither have you brought again that which was driven away, neither have you sought that which was lost. They've made no opportunity to go and try to take care of those sheep who are in desperate need of care. And then to add insult to injury, look at the last part of verse 4. But with force and with cruelty have you ruled them. Not only do you not positively care for them, but you have mistreated them. It's not only neglect, it's neglect and abuse that these shepherds had been dealing out to these sheep. Now, obviously, these are not literal shepherds and they're not literal sheep. Who is being referenced here in the immediate context? Do what? Okay, the children of Israel. And those elders, those chief men in Israel, whether you hang it on the priests and the high priest and those Levites, whether you hang it on the elders among the communities of the tribes of Israel, no matter who you hang it on, the leadership of Israel had failed their people. The problem in Israel, the problems were many, but the problem started with a leadership problem. And it trickled down into everything else. If you go back to the books of Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, God established these feast days. What were those for? What was the purpose of those? Primarily, does anybody remember? What's the Passover feast? What are you supposed to do during the Passover? Okay. They're reminders. But what do we see happening every time Israel begins to slip away from God? What's one of the first things that gets forgotten? It's those feast days. Well, whose fault is that? It's the leaders. Aren't they supposed to see that these things are carried out? At the very least, keep the policies that God put in place in place. If that doesn't happen, the buck stops with the leaders. The religious leaders who are also the social and political leaders of the day. They were the ones who should have made perfectly clear that these things were to be carried on. And yet the most obvious things were the ones that became neglected first. That's a leadership problem. It was not only a problem with the people who were being led, it was a problem with those who were doing the leading. And then those people who were doing the leading were content not only not to lead, but to abuse the ones that they were leading. And so this is a problem with multiple layers, and the problems just heap upon themselves. So what does God say are the consequences of this circumstance? Well, if you look at verse 10, notice what he says. Verse 9, he says, "Therefore, O you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against the shepherds, and I will require my flock at their hand, and cause them to cease from feeding the flock. Neither shall the shepherds feed themselves any more, for I will deliver my flock from their mouth, that they may not be meat for them." Are the shepherds responsible for how they feed the sheep? Personally responsible? And therefore they'll suffer personal consequences? Doesn't that sound like the same thing God said to Ezekiel as a watchman? You're the watchman. If you don't watch, they will suffer and you will too. He says in chapter 34, you're the shepherd. Since you didn't lead and feed your people, they have suffered and you will suffer too. It's about personal responsibility for those who have a position of leadership and obligation. Yes, sir. Oh, certainly. To actually do it. Oh, I agree. And when we make application, we'll have many points of application to make. But, Jesus said when he surveyed the people as he was preaching, they are like what? Sheep having no shepherd. And there's nothing worse, I'm told, than sheep with no shepherd. I'm told that sheep are among the dumbest animals. Is this true? I don't know, but that, anybody? They're helpless animals, yes. They need leadership. Do what? Oh, passive. Okay. They are helpless, though, and they are in great need of guidance and leadership. And so a sheep without a shepherd is pretty helpless. And that's the situation that we see the nation of Israel in, but that's exactly right. And unfortunately, in the Old Testament, there's the parable of the bramble that was elected the king of the trees, of the plants, right? When there's a vacuum in leadership, someone almost always takes over. But it might not always be who it needs to be. And so shepherds who are capable need to step up and be shepherds. And so that's certainly a point that we'll get to as we move forward. So the shepherds weren't leading as they should, and because of that, the sheep were suffering. And so now the shepherds are going to suffer the consequences of their own misdeeds, neglect, and abuse. And so now we do move into what about today? Obviously, any passage about shepherds has an immediate application to the elders of the New Testament. Are elders shepherds? Absolutely. That's what pastor means, right? That's what that means. They are shepherds of a flock. And over again, that idea is mentioned. In 1 Peter 5 and verse 2, Peter writes, what right does Peter have to talk to the eldership? Yeah, that's what he says in verse 1. Who am also an elder. And then he gives this inspired advice. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not of constraint, but willingly, not of filthy lucre, but of a willing mind. So the idea is connected here. Number one, feeding the flock is an obvious reference to shepherds. But then that word oversight has to do with one who is a superintendent or an overseer of a larger operation. And so you've got multiple ideas connected here. Elder is a wise and older person who is in a community, much like in the Old Testament. The word bishop or overseer has to do with someone who is overseeing a large operation. And then one who feeds the flock would be a shepherd. And so you see all of those ideas combined. The same is true in Acts 20 and verse 28, in which Paul tells the elders of Ephesus to take heed therefore unto yourselves and to all the flock over which the Holy Ghost hath made you overseers. That's a mixed metaphor. So he uses the same ideas and the same wording there. And then he says to feed the church of God which he hath purchased with his own blood. So again, shepherds, elders, overseers, presbyters all refer to that same office and that same obligation. And so absolutely we're talking here about elders. Elders have a responsibility to feed their flock. And I'm always cautious to talk about elders with elders because I don't want the implication to seem that we're saying that the elders aren't doing what they're supposed to do. Obviously, we're not trying to call out some failing of our eldership. First of all, because I don't believe that's the case. And second of all, if we were to need to do that, this is not the forum to do that in. But just like preachers need to be reminded of their obligation, elders do too, deacons do too, songly, everyone needs to be reminded of their obligation. And so we come through this as a reminder, number one, to elders and those who would be elders, that when you take on that responsibility, it is a direct responsibility to feed the flock. What does it mean to feed the flock? To care for them, okay. To teach them, to provide the information, okay. To correct them. Do what? To be an example. I think those things are true as well. To nourish. Okay? Think about, and Paul uses the idea of nourishing and strengthening. It's a motherly idea that when Paul uses it, the idea of nourishing is all-encompassing. It's instruction, it's physical nourishment, it's also correction and discipline. All of those things are included in the idea of being a shepherd. Shepherds need to know our business. They need to know our lives. They need to be in our lives. in order to properly feed. And so that puts an onus on the elders, but does it always also put a responsibility on us? Yeah. Can anybody think of any passages that talk about the responsibility of people to their elders? That's where I was heading. In Hebrews, that's not my phone. I left mine at home on accident. In verse 7, notice what it says. Remember them, Hebrews 13:7, which have the rule over you, who have spoken unto you the word of God, whose faith follow, considering the end of their conversation. Marion mentioned example. Whose faith follow. There's a reason why elders have such a high standard placed for their conduct and their behavior and their reputation. It's because we absolutely should follow them. Now look at verse 17. Obey them that have the rule over you, and submit yourselves. For they watch for your souls as they that must give account. And then here's why we do that they may do it with joy and not with grief. For this is unprofitable for you. In other words, what the Hebrews writer is saying is make the elder's job as easy as possible. Open up your lives, submit and obey. And recognize that they, if they're doing their jobs properly, have your best interest at heart. And the interesting thing is you said think of them as a parent, and that's true, but there's also a circumstance where, Arliss and David, they're two first people I see, they might work side by side in a work setting, right? They might, nothing makes Arliss better because he's an elder. Am I right? I don't mean to, throw Arliss, he's older and, maybe uglier and all that, but there's nothing that makes him physically any better than anybody else. But he's taken on a responsibility in the realm of the spiritual things to where he has an obligation for us. And so if he and David were to work side by side in a work setting, they're equals. And here they're equals in terms of their status before God, but he has responsibilities to watch for his soul and to watch for the souls of the others as well. And so we look at them as both brothers and parents, and it's a unique relationship. It absolutely is. And it's one that I know our elders don't take lightly, and it's one that should not be undertaken lightly, because the obligation and the responsibility that's there is very, very important. So shepherds are to feed the flock of God. They are to rule, they are to guide, they are to direct. All of the things contained in the idea of caring for sheep, our shepherds should do. Now, obviously, they can't, and ours won't, Lord willing, make decisions that are outside of the realm of the Word of God. They're bounded by the Word of God. But as it relates to the matters of expediency that happen every day, elders rule. How should we respond when elders make decisions? Okay. What if we have a problem with it? And go to them. Absolutely. That's why I said this isn't the forum to talk about the problems that an eldership might be having. In fact, the Bible teaches us that we should not do that in any sort of hasty manner. Rebuke not an elder. You've got to go through a process in order to approach them, because we need to give them the benefit of the doubt. Now, does that mean they're above making mistakes? Absolutely not. Only the preacher is above making mistakes. The elders cannot. Just kidding. Just kidding. It's probably true. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's right. That's the idea, too, that we need to, as a flock, understand that those shepherds need to be in our lives every single day, not necessarily physically in contact, but in our prayer life and everything that we think about in the kingdom of God. We need Mm-hmm. And that's certainly true. That relationship needs to be fostered. And the passage in John chapter 10 where Jesus, it's interesting, Jesus describes himself as the good shepherd. He describes himself as the door, and he's actually the sheepfold itself. So he is all of those things in that illustration. And but he certainly gives a good example for physical shepherds, that is spiritual shepherds, our elders, to follow. And so certainly this reminds us that our elders need to be individuals who feed the flock. But it's our obligation to make their jobs as easy as possible and to come to them, to open up to them, to submit to them. And that's our obligation. Any comments or questions about that? But when I read Ezekiel chapter 34, it does not only apply, in my mind, to the elders. Every one of us, just like every one of us is a watchman in some fashion. There's a sense in which every one of us is a shepherd, correct? I am not a pastor, whatever the world might think of my position, but I have a measure of obligation. And every individual does, whether it's as a parent, as maybe a teacher, or just as someone in a congregation and a community who has an influence on other people. So we cannot neglect our obligation in that way either. We may not be shepherds, but there are certainly other illustrations in the Bible given to describe our role, those of us who are not elders. For instance, we are laborers who work under overseers, right? And do those laborers have a measure of obligation towards those under them and towards the works that they're given? Absolutely. They can't say, well, if I don't do my job, it's the overseer's problem. No, it's my problem. I've got to have responsibility for the things that I'm in charge of and I'm responsible for in my life too. In Matthew 9, verses 37 and 38, the harvest is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray therefore the Lord of the harvest that he might send forth laborers into his vineyard. Who are the laborers? We are. We're the grunt labor, right? And so we need to make sure that we are fulfilling our obligation. We're not only sheep following a shepherd. We are also laborers working in that field. All sheep have to do is eat, right? And stick around and do whatever their shepherd tells them. But laborers have an obligation themselves, right? We are both sheep and laborers. And so we need to remember that our obligations exist as well in the sphere of laboring in the kingdom. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 9, we are laborers together with God. So we all work together. That's the interesting thing about the dynamic between shepherds and sheep in the church, is that we're all working together, right? You know, a shepherd works on behalf of his sheep in the physical sense. And he can't expect the sheep to help erect structures and mend fences and do all of those things. But in the church, the shepherds and the sheep work together. And that's what you see the picture of in 1 Corinthians 3 of the laborers together with God. But not only that, do fellow sheep have an obligation to each other? Well, absolutely we do. In the parable of the lost sheep, it is the shepherd that goes out and gets the sheep. But in our context, who often has the most opportunity to go get lost sheep? Other sheep, right? It's we sheep who can do the work in helping to bring back other sheep and bring new sheep into the fold as well.
I just pulled up that passage right before you mentioned that. I've read commentaries that stated that there were hirelings left behind to watch that flock. And the actual verse doesn't appear to say that. It says they were left in the open or the wilderness. And that's the thing about sheep. You know, you said they may be dumb. I think they're more passive. You said the lamb, I guess, but the sheep lamb. But the idea there is those sheep stay together.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't run
That's right. That's right. And that's exactly what happens. Either, I've known congregations that needed elders and didn't have them, and I know congregations that have had elders, but they didn't do what they were supposed to do. And I'm not saying, again, that this is necessarily one. But it is the case that shepherds need to be involved in the lives of their sheep, because if not, the sheep gradually will get away. I mean, what farmer, most of you don't have experience with sheep, but a lot of you do with cattle. What farmer worth his salt doesn't know how many head of cattle he's got, and doesn't at least take some effort to check up on his cattle and make sure they're where they're supposed to be? Any of you have that one person in the community that always their cows always seem to get out, and they don't seem to care about it like they should? And somebody else, I know, in our community, other people tend to get the cows up of this one person because they don't take care of them like they need to. Well, that's a bad overseer of the flock or of the herd or whatever the case might be. And so we've got to make sure that we understand what's going on. As a dad, I'm not always the best overseer of children. You dads ever gotten busy doing something and, where'd Johnny go? Whereas Mama seems to always have that eye on the kid, right? I'm like, they'll be fine, But we're not always on task as well as we need to be. But the shepherd must be zeroed in on those sheep, absolutely. So we are laborers working under overseers. We are fellow sheep who can and should guide one another. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:1, "Be you followers of me, as I also am of Christ." The easiest way to bring one sheep back is for the other sheep to go and say, hey, that sheep is much more likely to follow other sheep, right? And so we can be fellow sheep who guide others. And again, Ezekiel 33 is absolutely connected to this. We are watchmen watching out for each other. And therefore we cannot lose sight of our obligation to be watchmen, to be fellow sheep, and to be laborers in the field along with our shepherd. So any comments or questions about that?
Leadership involves being out front, carrying your share and more of the load,
Mm-hmm.
more so than what we think of as a boss or an overseer. Nobody likes working for a boss. Everybody likes working for a leader. There's a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
Think of the best person who've ever been supervised by. They were out there doing their share and more.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we try to do.
That's right. And again, the dynamic in the church is different, isn't it? Because a shepherd, in a sense, is a sheep as well, right? An individual elder is under the oversight of the eldership. Is that right? I mean, so in essence, they still have to live a faithful Christian life. They still have they have the same obligations placed upon them that every other member has. And that's one of the most interesting dynamics, whereas a boss can sometimes feel like they're above the law, so to speak. The classic example is at a job site, where is the supervisor often? Or in the truck, right? He's in the truck while it's 95 degrees outside on the asphalt or something, or we're 20 degrees outside in the cold. Meanwhile, the truck's running and the supervisor's in the truck. Well, that's not the picture that should be in the church. We should all be getting our hands dirty together. That's absolutely true. So, we are laborers, fellow sheep, and watchmen, and the shepherds have an obligation too. Any other questions or comments? All right. Next is in the book of Daniel. And in fact, it's near the end of the book of Daniel. It's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure that we'll finish with this discussion tonight, but we can at least get a good start on it. In Deuteronomy 12 and verse 8, this is Daniel speaking, and he says, "I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things?" And we can hear and we can probably feel Daniel's frustration, his confusion, and even a little bit of discouragement as he asks this question near the end of the book. Now, we could spend literally weeks backgrounding Daniel, but we're not going to do that. Daniel is I think maybe Daniel is one of the most difficult books in the Bible. People pin it on Revelation. Once you get the code to Revelation, it's pretty easy. It's sort of like on the back of the cereal boxes, they used to give you the decoder thing where you could look through it and all of a sudden you could see everything. Once you get Revelation decoded, it's pretty simple. Daniel, I mean, there are people who have devoted their lives to studying Daniel who still can't answer all of the questions that Daniel poses. But let's just do sort of a brief overview. In the book, Daniel receives visions concerning, number one, the future of Israel. Because he's in captivity and his people are in captivity. And so it's both the immediate and the quite distant future of his people. And in giving the future of Israel, he also gives a quick overview of world history. Now, future world history, but the powers that are going to rise and fall as all of this unfolds. You're familiar with Daniel chapter 2. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. That's the Roman kings, and he set that up by talking about those world powers. You remember you had Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. He mentions that in Daniel chapter 2, and he mentions that in Daniel chapter 7. I think it's safe to say that Daniel 10 through 12 take us there and even bring us into the Intertestament period, talk about the relationship between Persia and Egypt and how Egypt comes onto the scene again. And then it brings us into the New Testament era. And then begins to get, what's interesting is as it gets farther out, it gets more vague. And that's going to trouble Daniel. There are a number of occasions where Daniel's going to ask questions, and we'll get to that in just a second. Throughout everything that's talked about in the book of Daniel, there's always that singular emphasis, the church. And every time the camera goes off into the distance, that is what ends up being the focus, is the church. Somebody read Daniel 2:44, which I just referenced a moment ago. Okay, that's a depiction, obviously, of the church, the spiritual kingdom that will be set up in the New Testament. In chapter 7, look at verses 13 and 14. Daniel says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away. His kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. And then in chapter 12, we see a hint of it again. If you look at verse 1. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth up for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Now what's interesting is prophets all use similar language. Where's that language of names written in a book? Where is that found again? In the book of Revelation, right? It says in verse 2, And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. I've got out in my margin, beside verse 2, Ezekiel 37, 12 through 14, which is the valley of dry bones. Remember, God asks Ezekiel, can these bones live? And Ezekiel says, you know. And he says, yes, these bones will live. Is he talking about the physical resurrection? No, he's talking about the return of Israel from captivity. And ultimately, he's talking about the church. And I think the same thing is true here in Daniel chapter 12. He's talking about the spiritual resurrections that will take place when the doors to the church are opened in the coming of the new covenant. So I think you see that in Daniel as you move through the book. And again, we don't have time to delve into the weeks and the days and all of the abomination of desolation. And no, we're not going to get into all of that. But there's just a generic overview of what Daniel is seeing as he moves forward. And we do that because Daniel really struggled with these things. And understandably so. He was given divine assistance to understand, and still he had to scratch his head a good bit. In Daniel chapter 7 and verse 15 it says, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit in the midst of my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. That's right after that prophecy of the kingdom. These visions troubled him because can you imagine being given these messages from God and not being able to fully understand them? And you're recording them for people who are 500 years in the future? And you know that they won't have any benefit for you personally, and you don't have any idea what most of them are talking about in any specific way? You go to Daniel chapter 8 and verse 27, we see it again. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. Notice his burden as he goes through these visions. Verse 1 through 3 of chapter 10. In the 3rd year of Cyrus king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar, and the thing was true, and the time appointed was long. And he understood the thing, and he had understanding of the vision. So notice, it was a thing that was going to happen a long way out, but he understood it. But what was his response? Look at verse 2. In those days I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no pleasant bread, neither came flesh nor wine in my mouth, neither did I anoint myself at all, till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. Why? He understood it. What's the big deal? Because of the burden that this placed on him. And so Daniel is feeling all of these things as he moves through. And it's for that reason, I believe, that Daniel asks this question. What shall be the end of these things? I think the ESV gives us a little help here. It says, what shall the outcome of these things be? Have you ever wanted to know that question? The answer to that question? What's the outcome going to be? Have you ever noticed that science fiction is obsessed with time travel? Well, it's easy to understand why, isn't it? Wouldn't it be great to, number 1, be able to go back in time and fix the things you messed up? And wouldn't it, number 2, be great to be able to go into the future and to see what's waiting and what the outcome is? But the fact of the matter is, we can neither go back and fix things, nor move forward in the future and foresee things. All we can do is look in the present and trust what God has told us. And the limitations of our knowledge can be really, really frustrating, especially when things don't go like we want them to. And so what I think we're going to notice, and we don't have time to finish this discussion tonight, but what I think we're going to notice is that Daniel speaks for most of us when he says, God, can you tell me what the outcome of this is going to be? Because I really want to know. And that's a question that I think a lot of us have wanted answered at some point in our lives. Tell me how this ends, because I want to know. My wife's granny was an avid reader, and she read mystery novels. You know, nothing she read was super deep, but she read a lot, and as she got older, she read more. She even got this huge magnifying glass thing where her eyesight got so bad, and it would blow words up this big just so that she could read, but she wanted to read. But here's what the rascal would do. She would flip to the end, and she would read it, and then she'd continue reading the book, right? Yeah. Before she came too emotionally invested in a character, she would make sure that character survived to the end of the book. And then she'd go back and she'd read the story. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to do that in real life. But that's what Daniel's wanting, right? Tell me how it ends. Well, we're going to examine that a little bit more when you come back next Wednesday night. Thank you for your time and attention.